For many centuries, Spartans were rightly considered the most formidable and invincible warriors in all of Hellas. Their fame stretched far beyond the Peloponnese, and their combat skills inspired awe. From a young age, barely 7 years old, Spartan children were immersed in the rigorous training of deadly combat, becoming part of a ruthless military machine. A distinguishing feature of their society was that even the kings who ruled this mighty power did not shy away from danger, bravely fighting alongside their warriors on the battlefield. When the Spartan army began its triumphant march, it seemed nothing could stop its relentless conquest of Greek lands. However, like all earthly empires, even Sparta was not eternal. A natural and intriguing question arises: what ultimately happened to this great and once invincible civilization? History, full of surprising twists, reveals a paradox. Their greatest strength, that which elevated them to the peak of power, ultimately caused their tragic downfall. According to ancient traditions, Sparta's roots extend into the mythological era, where its founder is believed to be Lacedaemon himself, the valiant son of the supreme god Zeus. This magnificent legend undoubtedly adds an aura of divine origin to the city's history. However, when researchers turn to more rigorous historical and archaeological data, the picture becomes different, though no less intriguing. Scientific investigations indicate that Sparta was founded around 1000 BC. Its emergence is linked to the activities of an unknown but undoubtedly influential ruler who led a group of tribes belonging to the warlike Dorian ethnic group to this fertile region. Nevertheless, the mystery of Sparta's founding is not limited to this. Some historians suggest a possible connection between its origin and the legendary King Menelaus, whose name is inextricably linked to the epic events of the Trojan War. Despite the fact that precise information about Sparta's founder remains hidden in the mist of time, one thing is undeniable: whoever founded this unique polis laid the groundwork for one of the most powerful and warlike civilizations the world has ever known. The city-state of Sparta developed rapidly, steadily increasing its power and influence. Throughout its history, this unusual state was governed by 2 kings simultaneously, a unique political system. Spartan society was entirely focused on military affairs, and every citizen was educated in the spirit of absolute loyalty and selfless service to the state, which later played a key role in its destiny. At birth, every infant in Spartan society was carefully examined by a council of elders. These respected community members looked for any flaws or deficiencies in the newborn, and if the child was deemed unviable or unfit for future service to Sparta, it was left on a nearby hill. Some ancient traditions even state that unhealthy infants were mercilessly thrown from the summit of Mount Taygetus into a deep chasm. However, recent archaeological and historical research indicates that the Spartans may have shown greater compassion and raised their children, even if they were not physically perfect. Nevertheless, if a child had a serious disability, it was highly unlikely that they would have been able to withstand the rigorous training regimen that every Spartan boy had to undergo from the age of 7. This unique military educational program, known as the Agoge, distinguished Spartan warriors from all other Greeks. Spartan children were willingly handed over to the state by their parents, where they began their years of training and learned the true meaning of what it meant to be a true Spartan. Throughout this intensive education, they were also instilled with the idea that loyalty to Sparta must prevail over all other aspects of their lives. This absolute submission included prioritizing the state over family ties, personal wealth, or the pursuit of power. A Spartan child was taught to be ruthless and deadly in combat, and never to disobey the orders of their commanders or kings. This unwavering loyalty and outstanding combat skills, acquired from a young age, made Spartan warriors so formidable and lethal on any battlefield. In 480 BC, tales and epic songs spread throughout Hellas, celebrating the incomparable valor and exceptional strength of Spartan warriors. It was during this momentous period that King Leonidas, at the head of his legendary unit of 300 Spartans, led a small contingent of Athenians and representatives from other Greek city-states against the countless army of the Persian king Xerxes. These fearless Spartan warriors heroically held back Xerxes' forces at the hot gates of Thermopylae for 3 days. Regardless of what forces the Persians threw into battle, King Leonidas and his comrades bravely repelled one attack after another. Xerxes even deployed his most formidable fighters, known as the Immortals, in an attempt to break through the Spartan defensive line, but even they suffered a crushing defeat. Ultimately, the fate of Leonidas and his valiant warriors was sealed by the betrayal of a fellow Greek, who showed Xerxes a mountain pass that allowed him to bypass the Spartan positions. This treacherous act allowed the Persian forces to encircle the Spartan soldiers. The sacrifice of King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans at Thermopylae was forever etched in the annals of history, becoming a true legend. Their self-sacrifice granted the people of Greece precious time needed to mobilize their forces and subsequently expel the Persians, forcing them to leave Greek lands. Approximately 50 years after the Persian Wars, Athens and Sparta established themselves as the two dominant powers in ancient Greece. Each sought to expand its influence throughout Hellas, which inevitably led to deep contradictions and tension between these two great civilizations. This tension rapidly escalated into a large-scale conflict, later known as the Peloponnesian Wars. Their outcome led Sparta to achieve the status of the most powerful city-state in all of Greece, yet this very victory, paradoxically, became a harbinger of its own decline. Between the Persian War and the start of the First Peloponnesian War, Athens and Sparta were in a state of permanent confrontation, expressed in frequent border skirmishes and mutual raids. These clashes, which resulted in significant casualties and the depletion of material resources, nevertheless did not escalate to the level of total war. The situation changed in the cold months of 445 BC when a peace treaty, intended to last for 3 decades, was concluded between Sparta and Athens. However, in 431 BC, Corinth, one of Sparta's key allies, became embroiled in a conflict with Athenian military forces. In response, Athens invaded Corinthian territory, and Sparta immediately moved to defend its ally. Thus, the terms of the 30 Years' Peace Treaty were irrevocably violated, which served as the catalyst for the start of the Second Peloponnesian War. Sparta, possessing superiority in land forces, launched large-scale military campaigns in Athenian territories. During these operations, the Spartans systematically destroyed enemy defenses, plundered cities, and seized fertile lands. Recognizing the impossibility of achieving a decisive victory over the Spartans in a direct land confrontation, the Athenians turned to the sea, using their powerful fleet to inflict retaliatory damage on Sparta. Athenian forces actively carried out naval raids, as their ships unequivocally dominated both in open and coastal waters. Long before and immediately after the Persian War, Athens systematically built an impressive armada of fast ships capable of high maneuverability even in confined and narrow sea straits. This mobility allowed them to carry out amphibious operations almost anywhere along the extensive Spartan coast. Their ships would anchor in close proximity to the coastline, after which Athenian troops would swiftly attack Spartan settlements. Before Sparta could regroup and redeploy its ground forces to repel them, the Athenians would already retreat to the safe expanses of the Mediterranean and Aegean seas, changing location for their next sudden raid. A stalemate arose due to Sparta's inability to conquer the city of Athens, protected by impregnable fortifications, and the realization that the Athenian army could never defeat the valiant Spartan forces on land. In 421 BC, both sides signed an agreement by which Sparta and Athens pledged mutual defense for the next 50 years. This ensured that the two powerful city-states would refrain from military action against each other as long as the so-called Peace of Nicias was in effect. Both societies had reached the peak of their power, and their influence extended over vast territories, creating the impression that a temporary truce would satisfy everyone for a while. However, these expectations proved futile. Just 6 years after the peace treaty was ratified, Sparta again launched an aggression against Athenian possessions. The Spartan polis had become so powerful that its ambitions extended to new lands and resources. The Spartans did not seek to transform the rest of Greece into a likeness of their own state, as their unique social system was based on preserving Spartan citizenship exclusively for members of specific bloodlines. Nevertheless, they desired to expand their empire to acquire more people for their armies as helots, and to increase their people's wealth. This time, all allies of each polis joined the large-scale confrontation, involving the Delian League, led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League, led by Sparta, in an unprecedented conflict. Military actions continued for several more years, shaking the Greek world. In 420 BC, Sparta faced serious consequences for its actions. It was excluded from the sacred Olympic Games for a blatant violation of the truce, which again plunged Greece into chaos. The final conclusion of this exhausting war came in 404 BC, when Athenian forces suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of Sparta in the decisive Battle of Embodiment. The Spartans, having learned from the bitter experience of past mistakes, realized the critical necessity of neutralizing the powerful Athenian fleet if they ever seriously hoped to achieve a complete victory over their irreconcilable adversary. Therefore, in the period between the Peloponnesian Wars, they purposefully invested significant time and material resources in improving their own naval vessels, striving to bring their technical characteristics to a level comparable to those of Athens. It was the Spartan commander Lysander who masterfully commanded this revamped fleet, leading it to triumph at Embodiment, which brought the protracted conflict to a definitive end. However, despite Sparta emerging victorious from the Peloponnesian Wars and significantly expanding its influence throughout Greece, the great civilization found itself on the brink of inevitable decline. Sparta, although it became the most powerful city-state in the region, faced a severe demographic problem. The reason for its territorial expansion was not overpopulation of its native lands. On the contrary, Sparta's population had been steadily declining for a long time. As a result, Spartans constituted a minority among the inhabitants of their newly acquired empire. The years of the Peloponnesian War weighed heavily on Sparta, claiming the lives of countless citizens. Every victory they achieved on the battlefield, no matter how significant, inevitably turned bittersweet, for every conflict demanded irreplaceable sacrifices among their citizen warriors. After the protracted confrontation with Athens, Sparta was in desperate need of a significant increase in its population to compensate for the colossal human losses sustained in battles. Without a powerful and numerous army, maintaining control over their vast empire became unthinkable. However, despite recognizing this critical demographic problem, Spartan society seemed to take no active steps to resolve it. Instead of focusing its efforts on population growth and strengthening the internal stability of its homeland, Sparta continued to engage in military campaigns wherever it deemed necessary. With the acquisition of dominant power in Greece, the traditional conservative nature of Spartan society apparently began to wane, giving way to an insatiable desire among its citizens for even greater power and wealth. Spartan armed forces systematically violated previously concluded alliances and invaded new territories, which, in turn, inevitably provoked numerous revolts throughout their vast empire. One obvious way to increase the population would have been to allow people from outside Sparta to join their society, but this radically contradicted the strict, centuries-old rules that Sparta had rigorously followed for hundreds of years. Sparta's internal system not only hindered any efforts to expand the number of Spartan citizens but also practically excluded the possibility of rapidly training a significant number of new warriors. The only way to achieve the status of a Spartan fighter was to complete the embodiment. A crucial condition of this grueling process was the requirement that each trainee independently acquire the necessary equipment and endure all stages of the harsh and intense training course. Anyone unable to meet these conditions was denied the right to become a full-fledged Spartan warrior. Given that by no means everyone who began their journey in the embodiment completed it, the number of Spartan soldiers steadily decreased. This state of affairs forced Sparta to rely heavily on attracting outsiders to replenish its military formations. However, these mercenary or allied fighters rarely possessed a level of training comparable to that of true Spartans, and their loyalty to Spartan ideals was significantly lower than that of native citizens. However, not only the shortage of warriors for replenishment and the inevitable reliance on external support were the main factors that led to Sparta's decline in the post-war years following the Peloponnesian War. Parallel to these external challenges, the Spartan leaders themselves began to succumb to the vice of greed, gradually losing sight of their inherent and sacred values, honor and selfless defense of the state. Among Spartan commanders and warriors, there was an increasing tendency to focus on personal interests, relegating the pursuit of maintaining Sparta's state power to the background. This shift in worldview, as well as the insatiable desire to accumulate personal wealth instead of strengthening state status, led to deep economic stratification within Spartan society. As a result, some citizens achieved extraordinary prosperity, while others steadily plunged into destitution. As expected, such economic polarization generated significant social tension among the Spartans. However, the resulting wealth disparity led to another serious problem that further exacerbated the decline in the number of Spartan warriors. As Spartan families became poorer, they were unable to afford the necessary uniforms and equipment required for their children to participate in the agoj training system. It was not that these young citizens lacked the potential to become outstanding warriors, but rather the inability to acquire their own equipment automatically meant their unsuitability for training as Spartan soldiers. It remains unclear how deeply the ruling elite, including the kings of Sparta and other prominent members of society, recognized this growing problem, or whether they showed complete indifference to its consequences. Meanwhile, the disenfranchised citizens of Sparta increasingly expressed their indignation about how their polis was governed, while being deprived of the opportunity to fulfill their sacred military duty. The absence of a constant influx of fresh recruits undermined the very foundation on which the existence of the Spartan state rested. By 375 BC, Sparta's situation had become truly dire. Rebellions erupted throughout the Hellenic world, and once defeated enemies steadily grew in power. One polis, in particular, became an unbearable nuisance to Spartan ambitions. It was this region of Greece that was destined to play a key role in the ultimate fall of Spartan hegemony. Thebes, in turn, steadily gained political and military weight in the decades following the triumphant victory of Sparta and its allies in the Peloponnesian Wars. Although Spartan garrisons held control over this region for almost 30 years, their influence gradually weakened, and their positions in Thebes were steadily eroded. This state of affairs was completely unacceptable to the proud Spartans, and they immediately launched a large-scale military campaign aimed at the complete subjugation of the Thebans. In 371 BC, King Cleombrotus I personally led the Spartan forces against the talented Theban strategist Epaminondas, who commanded the army of the Boeotian League. This fateful battle, destined to take place near Leuctra, brought not only a completely unexpected result but also forever changed the entire course of Greek history. King Cleombrotus had just over 10,000 warriors at his disposal. However, due to a severe shortage of native Spartan citizens, only about 700 of them were true Spartiates, hereditary warriors who had undergone the rigorous agoj. This implied that the remaining warriors, although they could show valor on the battlefield, would never achieve the unparalleled effectiveness and discipline that was characteristic of an army consisting solely of 10,000 Spartan hoplites. Such a personnel situation reflected the new, harsh reality of Spartan warfare. Even the supreme ruler was forced to make do with only a handful of true Spartans in his battle formations. In addition to the foot soldiers, Cleombrotus also had a detachment of approximately 1,000 cavalry, intended to strengthen his flanks and provide reconnaissance. After long years marked by relentless struggle to maintain dominance over its vast empire, Sparta faced growing discontent. Warriors recruited from subject city-states, known as helots, showed far less enthusiasm in the upcoming battles than the Spartan monarch's ambitions would have required. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the Theban army was arrayed, numbering an impressive 7,000 hoplites and 600 cavalry. The commander Epaminondas was well aware that Theban cavalry was rightly considered one of the best in all of Hellas, and he undoubtedly intended to use this superiority in his tactical designs. However, the most significant asset for Thebes was Epaminondas himself, an outstanding military strategist. His track record already included several brilliant victories, and he was determined to make Sparta pay in full for years of oppressing the Theban people. A significant portion of other Theban commanders strongly urged Epaminondas to retreat behind the secure fortifications of Thebes to force the Spartans into a grueling siege of the city. However, Epaminondas, possessing an unyielding will, was not going to succumb to any pressure from the Spartans. Retreat was not considered an acceptable solution by him. He was firmly confident in his ability to outwit the Spartan warriors, as he had thoroughly studied their preferred military strategy. For many centuries, the Spartans had employed the same phalanx tactic, which almost invariably led them to success. Nevertheless, Epaminondas had already developed an innovative plan capable of breaking through Sparta's neat lines and allowing his troops to decisively and irrevocably defeat the enemy. At the very beginning of the grand battle, Commander Cleombrotus acted exactly as the far-sighted Epaminondas had anticipated. The Spartan warriors lined up in a traditional phalanx, whose depth reached 12 men, with 2 distinctly defined flanks. By ancient military tradition, the right flank was always significantly stronger than the left, and it was on this fortified position that Cleombrotus himself stood, surrounded by his 300 personal bodyguards. Seeing a clear vulnerability in such a predictable enemy formation, Epaminondas firmly decided to make his opponent pay dearly for his unwillingness to implement tactical innovations and blind adherence to outdated dogmas. In response, Epaminondas rearranged his own troops, concentrating an incredible depth of 50 men on his left flank, while simultaneously narrowing the overall lines of formation. This maneuver was designed to create a powerful striking force. Moreover, to intensify this assault, Epaminondas also deployed his cavalry from the left flank, forming a truly formidable striking force capable of crushing the Spartan formation. The 2 great Greek armies rushed towards each other, and the battlefield instantly transformed into a hellish maelstrom. Spears mercilessly pierced living flesh, massive shields shattered from devastating blows, warriors fell to the ground, struck down by deadly wounds. The earth quickly soaked with crimson blood, but at that moment something completely incredible happened, changing the course of the entire battle. Unexpectedly, the monolithic Spartan defensive line wavered and then broke. This critical breach immediately opened the way for the Theban cavalry, which stormed through the enemy formation like a whirlwind, beginning to sow chaos and panic directly within the ranks of the Spartan soldiers. Following the cavalry, Theban infantry poured into the breach, swiftly flanking and encircling the Spartans. The situation for Cleombrotus and his troops began to rapidly crumble, foreshadowing inevitable defeat. In the unfolding events, Epaminondas ordered his forces to attack at a sharp angle to the left. This strategic maneuver tactically pushed Cleombrotus and his Spartan warriors further from the epicenter of the main clash. Consequently, they were unable to regroup in time to provide much-needed support to the breached defensive line. In a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the battle, Cleombrotus left formation with his men and swiftly rushed to the opposite side of the battlefield. However, the elite Theban soldiers, known as the Sacred Band, had already taken their positions. When the Spartans approached, they were caught off guard by an unexpected and powerful blow. In this decisive clash, Cleombrotus was killed, and the Spartan forces had to begin a retreat. This event marked the first time Sparta had suffered a major defeat in a large-scale battle in recent memory, which became a true turning point for the entire Spartan Empire, as this loss heralded a series of subsequent failures. Epaminondas, not missing a strategic opportunity, used the momentum gained from the defeat of Cleombrotus and his Spartan forces to deepen his advance into Spartan territory. In doing so, he did not aim to conquer the peoples living in their lands. Instead, the commander sought only to liberate them from the yoke of Spartan rule. Epaminondas understood perfectly that if he could incite a rebellion among the Helots and other dependent servants of the Spartans, it would further undermine the power of the great empire. Following the catastrophic defeat that befell Sparta at Leuctra, the Peloponnesian League, once a mighty stronghold of Spartan influence, was finally dissolved. The overwhelming majority of Sparta's former allies, witnessing its weakening, deemed their continued participation in the alliance no longer viable. Sparta was steadily losing its former might, transforming from a leader into a burdensome partner rather than a reliable protector. Meanwhile, on the domestic front, the Helots and slaves, who formed the backbone of the former Spartan Empire's labor force, began to actively resist, striving to cast off their centuries-old yoke. Throughout Hellas, independent city-states flourished anew, heralding a new era of political fragmentation and sovereignty. Having achieved a triumphant victory over Sparta, Thebes swiftly rose, establishing itself as the undisputed leader and most powerful city-state in the region. Their ambitions extended to creating a new, vast empire, which caused deep concern and opposition among many other Greek polis unwilling to submit to this new hegemony. In an attempt to prevent further bloodshed and stabilize the precarious balance of power, Athens tried to organize a general peace conference in 371 BC. However, the Thebans, intoxicated by their success, categorically rejected this initiative. Instead, they continued their military actions, crushing the remaining Spartan forces and completely expelling them from their own territories. Indeed, at that moment, it seemed nothing could curb their expansion, and this feeling was well-founded. The situation reached such a critical point that even long-standing antagonists, Sparta and Athens, were forced to put aside their centuries-old differences and join forces, standing shoulder to shoulder to fight against the common enemy, Thebes. However, Thebes, in turn, managed to secure the support of an unexpected ally, a power that for centuries had represented an existential threat to the entire Greek way of life and independence. Thus, Thebes forged a strategic alliance with Persia, whose might and resources proved invaluable aid in continuing their ambitious conquest plans in Greece. This powerful alliance continued to demonstrate its superiority, achieving victories over Sparta and Athens, even when these two once dominant polis combined their forces. Spartan warriors, facing overwhelming pressure, were forced to retreat, with their homeland remaining their only refuge. Despite losing its vast empire and former political influence, Sparta nonetheless managed to retain its status as an independent city-state. Although Sparta could still boast the finest warriors in all of Greece, the consequences of the Peloponnesian War proved excessively burdensome, leading to a critical overextension of resources and strength, which ultimately resulted in enormous costs. At that point, their military contingent was sufficient only to contain potential threats from other polis, while the Spartans made desperate attempts to regroup and formulate further strategy. According to estimates, the Spartan citizen population more than halved, falling from approximately 9,000 to 4,000 citizens, between the zenith of their power and their devastating defeat at the Battle of Leuctra. The primary cause of this catastrophic demographic decline was the relentless death of soldiers on battlefields, even in cases where the Spartans ultimately triumphed. With their military might weakened and an acute shortage of young citizens suitable for military training, Sparta completely lost the ability to conquer adjacent territories and, consequently, to enslave their inhabitants, turning them into helots to replenish their ranks and maintain their economy. The situation reached such a critical point that the Spartans had to take the unprecedented step of admitting non-citizens into their society in a desperate attempt to increase the population, but even this measure did not yield the desired result. While the Spartan population steadily declined, neighboring city-states experienced the opposite. Their populations began to grow, and as a result, they no longer needed to fear the weakened Spartans. For over a century, Sparta remained in deep isolation. Although this warlike society continued to undertake occasional raids on adjacent lands, it clearly lacked sufficient power or necessary resources to not only revive its former glory but also to effectively hold back the onslaught of any invading forces. The last ruler of independent Sparta was a man named Nabis. His ascension to the throne was marred by cruelty. He seized power by ordering the execution of two other Spartans whose claims to the throne were considered far more legitimate than his own. To completely eradicate any possibility of future opposition, he ruthlessly ended their two noble bloodlines. Nabis himself possessed neither a pleasant disposition nor the impeccable honor for which true Spartans were renowned for centuries. On the contrary, his character was marked by excessive greed and profound selfishness. Upon ascending the throne, Nabis seemed to decide that it was time for Sparta to reclaim at least some of its former glory. However, his motivation was far from caring for the welfare of ordinary Spartan citizens. He sought to revive the state solely to strengthen his own power and amass personal wealth. During the Macedonian Wars, he initially sided with Macedon, and through this alliance, he managed to secure additional territories for Sparta. However, when the fortune of war suddenly turned against the Macedonians, Nabis, displaying his characteristic opportunism, immediately decided to switch sides and reorient Spartan policy to support Rome. Ultimately, a peace treaty was concluded between powerful Rome and Macedon. Despite this, Nabis still harbored the ambitious dream of creating a vast Spartan empire. These events inevitably led to the outbreak of the Laconic War, which erupted in 195 BC. In this conflict, Sparta found itself pitted against a powerful coalition that included Rome, the Achaean League, Pergamum, Rhodes, and Macedon. It is important to note that during the Macedonian Wars, Sparta had already established control over Argos. The Roman Republic, in recognition of their military service and participation in the conflicts, allowed Sparta to retain this territory. Subsequently, Argos was incorporated into Laconia, which at that time was an extensive region of Greece under full Spartan control. Ruler Nabis, seeking to consolidate his power and alter the social landscape, took decisive steps. He confiscated property and land from wealthy landowners in Argos and then redistributed them among helots who showed exceptional loyalty to him personally. Concurrently with these internal reforms, Nabis actively worked to build up Sparta's military strength. He initiated the construction of an imposing fleet and undertook extensive work to fortify the city walls, preparing for future challenges and ensuring state security. In the social sphere, his efforts aimed at expanding economic opportunities for Spartan citizens, which, he believed, would contribute to the revival and strengthening of the Spartan army. However, this process progressed quite slowly. Nabis also granted freedom to slaves in Argos, who were immediately conscripted into service as helots to augment the ranks of the Spartan armed forces. Thus, for many of them, this liberation effectively meant merely transitioning under the rule of a new oppressor. Nabis, as many then believed, was steadily progressing towards fulfilling his ambitious promise to revive Sparta's former might and create a much more powerful state. However, he was not destined to witness the final realization of these far-reaching plans. When the bloody Macedonian War concluded, the Spartans proved unyielding, categorically refusing to cede their newly acquired territories. Rome, seeking to avoid further conflict, attempted diplomatic persuasion, insisting that Nabis transfer strategically important Argos to the control of the Achaean League. But the Spartan ruler remained adamant, rejecting these demands. Such stubbornness inevitably led to a formidable coalition, comprising Greek police and powerful Roman legions, being forced to declare war on Sparta. Shortly after this declaration, the Romans and their allies launched a massive offensive on the coastal cities of Laconia, methodically reclaiming them from Spartan control. Simultaneously, the Achaean League, acting decisively, stormed and fully captured Argos. It became evident that Sparta, despite all of Nabis' efforts, simply did not possess sufficient strength to successfully resist the combined might of Rome and other influential Greek city-states. This devastating blow was, in essence, the final nail in the coffin of Spartan statehood. All minor achievements gained in the preceding period were completely nullified, and Sparta had neither the strength nor the time to rebuild its rapidly collapsing civilization in the face of impending, even more severe upheavals. As a result of these events, Sparta was stripped of its independence, falling under the vigilant and close supervision of Rome. Nabis continued to rule for some time, but his reign came to an end when he was assassinated in 192 BC. With the death of the last king of free Sparta, any hope, any dream of creating a new Spartan empire, vanished, buried with him into oblivion. Several years after the conclusion of the Laconic War, the Achaean League made significant efforts to maintain diplomatic relations with powerful Rome, simultaneously managing internal affairs in its part of Greece according to its own discretion. However, the Romans unequivocally stated their position: the Achaean League was not permitted further territorial expansion, especially towards Sparta. Despite a long-standing desire to incorporate Sparta into its ranks, stemming from the Laconic War period, the Achaeans refrained from such actions, fearing Roman displeasure. The problem was that constant Spartan raids on Achaean territories remained a persistent source of concern, causing growing dissatisfaction and feeling like a serious burden. When the Achaean League appealed to Rome for a solution to this problem, the Roman response was quite limited. They merely dispatched a diplomatic mission intended to mediate a peaceful settlement. Unfortunately, Sparta ignored the terms of the agreement reached through these diplomatic efforts. Eventually, in 148 BC, having exhausted its patience with constant provocations, the Achaean League took decisive action, launching a full-scale invasion of Spartan territory. They successfully entered the city-state and established control over the Spartan populace, subjugating it to their will. However, the Roman Republic immediately deemed this act unacceptable and a direct violation of previously reached agreements with the Achaean states. In response, Roman legions began a military invasion of Achaea. Meanwhile, Sparta, seizing the opportunity, reasserted its right to independence and offered fierce resistance to its recent captors. Thus, the Achaean League found itself in an extremely difficult position, forced to simultaneously confront both the resurgent Spartan forces and the powerful army of Rome. Such a combination of military challenges undoubtedly became an insurmountable burden for the Achaean League, determining its future fate. Roman legions advanced rapidly through Greek lands, ruthlessly asserting their authority. The Achaeans, whose capacity for independent decision-making was now highly questionable, could no longer be trusted. Consequently, the Roman statesman Lucius Mummius ordered the demolition of all defensive walls that once protected the cities involved in the Achaean League's revolt. This large-scale restructuring of the region under Roman rule also included the complete subjugation of Sparta. Over time, Rome, demonstrating a degree of leniency, allowed Sparta and Athens to regain their status as independent city-states. However, for Sparta, this newfound freedom held very little value, as its period of occupation had been so prolonged that it had lost almost all the unique characteristics that originally defined its civilization. To compound matters, in 267 CE, the Goths descended upon Greece from the north, brutally sacking Sparta. The once formidable Spartans proved unable even to defend their own homeland. The fall of one of the most remarkable Greek empires that ever existed was finally complete. Sparta evolved from a humble nomadic tribe into a mighty city-state, capable of holding back Xerxes with just 300 warriors. It conquered Athens and forged an impressive empire. Unfortunately, at some point, the Spartans may have overestimated their strength, and everything they had worked so diligently to build began to crumble rapidly. The Spartan people tried to preserve their unique identity until the very end, but were ultimately and irrevocably subjugated. Nevertheless, even today, Spartans are remembered by posterity as one of the greatest warrior civilizations in human history.